All these systems are set up. That's why they're called systems of oppression. What are they oppressing? They're oppressing our autonomy. And it's so much easier to oppress us in the outside structures if we've also been psychologically oppressed. One of my followers commented on a video and asked about deconstructing and did I see one system after another? And I've spent a few days thinking about this concept of deconstruction. I first heard that term in terms of deconstructing Christianity or deconstructing evangelism. I came from Evangelical Christian, and that was one of the first things that I, quote, deconstructed without knowing that I was deconstructing. And like the commenter, thank you, Steph, I've had a couple clients recently are like, once I see, I can't unsee. And that is very discombobulating, but it also means you're being liberated in a lot of ways. I thought that this piece of paper had my little definition of deconstruction, but I grabbed the wrong one. Deconstruction, for me, my definitions, started with self-awareness and self-examination. And in the simplest ways, when through the avenue of personal development, we kind of are taught to question our reality. Without understanding what the concept of deconstruction was, deconstructing systems, deconstructing capitalism, deconstructing patriarchy, and all these things, it's just the way I see the world. Even as a little kid, not quite an engineer, but I'm the kind of person that would love to take something apart to see how it works. Which is interesting and kind of ironic because I also was so easily brainwashed. But there's always been this little explorer and now grown-ass woman explorer. And so for me, deconstruction is being willing to examine my own beliefs, my own behaviors, and the motives for those beliefs. And this is a big distinction that I stand in across all the things I work in. For example, my husband is also often like off the cuff saying, why does somebody behave like that? And inside, I have become a person who, when I see behavior, I also see a hypothesis for motivation. What's underneath the behavior? For me, it started out when I was 36, maybe even before that. I think I remember even before that, when I was 27, 28 years old, and I was a school teacher in a Catholic school. I had wonderful conversations with my boss, who was at the time closeted, but a very devout Catholic and bound by the world he grew up in as two. We're still friends, but we would have these conversations about Mary and how I came from the Evangelical Christian world, and we didn't do all that. And so just having these philosophical conversations, disagreeing, it was fun to examine. And I'll never forget one day, because I wasn't Catholic, when we would go to Catholic Mass, as a kindergarten teacher and an adult, I had to cross my arms during communion. And in the Catholic Church, until you've gone through your first communion, you do this thing that says, I'm not eligible for communion. And that got my wheels thinking. I later became a technology coordinator, so I didn't have to go through the line. I just sat in the back of the church. But I began questioning my beliefs about Christianity, and I will never forget, I don't know what day it was, but I know exactly where I was sitting. I know what car I was sitting in, and I know what corner lot, like what stop sign I was at, when I was like, I don't think I believe this anymore. And that was a very intentional unlearning that has brought me a lot of good, which allowed me to unlearn in a lot of other areas. So psychologically, unlearning a lot of the things that harm me now allowed me to begin to deconstruct other things. And so the first was that first layer of Christianity. Oh, the elementary school. And I remember us saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and I was like, I mean, we grew up saying the Pledge of Allegiance in school and all that other stuff. We also said pledge to the Christian flag and pledge to the state of Texas. And as an adult, I think that's weird. I think the Pledge of Allegiance is psychotic. If you go and look at Russian state, the Russian Hitler Youth, they're doing the same kind of things. And I'm like, we were doing that too, but we were taught they were wrong. So that was another little layer of, I'm not going to put my hand over my heart and say I pledge this. I don't. And that doesn't make me anti-American. It doesn't make me a bad human being. And then in 2014, I had a retreat at my house, and one of my clients brought up the question of white privilege. And I'd never heard that term. And like many white people, at first I got confused and kind of offended. But we all sat at the table that night, and there were Black women in the room, and a lot of us Southern white women, and my client who'd already done a lot of internal work around being white and decolonizing her thinking, and is a activist in her own communities. And I learned a lot with my feet under the table of someone I love and trust who was saying, let's talk about this. Right? She wasn't mean. It wasn't somebody screaming on the internet. And so I did a lot of work from 2014 to 17, paying attention to deconstructing racism and my beliefs about that. I am not done. That is an ongoing journey. And there is so much. So one of the other things was I was looking at deconstructing the things I've internalized beliefs, internalized identities. And I didn't intend to deconstruct capitalism, and I didn't set out to deconstruct patriarchy. But as I was doing my own unlearning in my system, so with compassion, thinking about and listening to inner parts of me that held certain beliefs that hurt, and in conversation with these parts, in exploration and curious exploration, where did you first hear that? Where did you learn that? And we do this thing where we witness and we validate. And then when we're ready, we update those parts to, here's who I am now. This is what I've gone through. This is what's true currently. It's this year. Anyways, in working through those processes with various ones of my parts, I began to see, for me, it started out with Evangelical Christianity, is like, why would they tell us that? And my work, even back when I was a hardcore sales coach, my work as a child, I didn't even know I was doing it, is this work of self-trust. And I would get so internally ruptured because I would have these moments of like, why don't I try? Like, I know this, but why does my body react differently? And I realized all the ways that I was brainwashed by society, by education, by my parents, by my environment, by mass consciousness. In the coaching world, everybody's like the conscious collective, and that was mass consciousness. But I had never really heard the term system until I went to look up internal family system. And when I started studying internal family systems, I really took some time to explore that world and got that your family is a system, your school is a system, your neighborhood is a system, my internal world is a system, my relationship and the people that live in this whole household is a system. And then it goes further out, right? Our governments are systems, our local governments are systems, corporations are systems. But then there's the bigger systems of colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, these systems of oppression, religion, high demand religion. Really, honestly, my view is all religion. And in a lot of ways, so I got very involved in like the New Age in 2010 through 14, the New Age spiritual. And I was like, this is just Christianity. It's just a different flavor. It's doing the same. It's limiting my self-trust. And so as I began to explore building my own true self-trust, not just an idea, I began to come up against the things in life that told me out loud or silently not to trust myself. And there's a thing called interoception, and interoception is a physio-psychological set of skills that we learn. So some of the physical ones are like, as a child, we learn how to be potty trained. And part of that learning how to be potty trained is sensing when we need to use the restroom, sensing when we're hungry or thirsty, right? When we're babies, adults put us in diapers because we can't be trusted to not pee all over the place. Well, interoception also involves psychological senses and urges. So the sense of trusting your gut, right? Take it from the phrase and go down to the reality. How many of us, I've had this conversation thousands of times. How many of us have you ever had a time when you knew in your gut, in your body, in your bones, in your heart, that this was the decision and everybody else thought something else, and ultimately you were right? I think that's a very common human experience. As I began to look, I was like, oh, well, if you're taught to trust God, and anytime you have an experience of discomfort, or you have an experience of, for me, a lot of it was like emotional discomfort as a child that was invalidated by alcoholic parents who could not handle emotional rupture, where in school and church, it was seen as bad behavior. Listen, I literally got in trouble in first grade at church for not closing my eyes while praying. And so some kind of emotional, go to your room until you're in a better mood. So when I would have upset, there was separation or condemnation. If you doubted, you were going to hell. If you were like Lot's wife who disobeyed and looked back, you were disintegrated into nothing. That one hit a core memory for me as a third grade Allison in Miss Shepherd's class at Hyde Park Baptist in Austin, Texas. And I began to slowly, because this is the way I choose to work, slowly see these puzzle pieces. And it almost became this flippant thing in my coaching. And I was like, yeah, they, capital they, and you can put that into any system, whether it was your parents all the way up to these big systems, they teach you that to either control you or so that you buy shit you don't need. And I have struggled for my entire able to buy shit life with buying things that I don't need. I come from a family who, it couldn't make extreme hoarding on TV, but I come from a family who does hoard a lot of things and does not throw out a lot of things and attaches identity. And it is easy for me, and has been an intentional deconstruction of my attachment to stuff or to buying stuff and to noticing. So that was the other thing. I had this problem. It was like, I bought shit I couldn't afford, or I bought shit willy-nilly. And I began many years ago, just instead of criticizing the buying, I became curious about what's the craving behind the buying. And so I would slow down and I would notice, what am I craving? Am I craving a dopamine hit? Am I wanting to buy something that I think will make me look better? And why do I want that? Not from a judgy place, but from a very compassionate place. I didn't realize it, but I was doing another form of deconstruction. And you're right, Stephanie, the more I looked, the more I saw it everywhere. And then when I would see these things in government, and it was interesting, we were having a conversation the other day in one of my small groups. I had a leadership circle, and it was our last circle. And there's a girl in there that doesn't watch the news the way that a couple of us do. That's her values and what she chooses. And I said, but that's the thing. People see me and Anna as someone who watches the news. But Anna, this other person, and I are not people who just watch the news. We don't just buy what we're heard. We deconstruct what we're being told. I will say I did get a lot of things from my religious school, including Mrs. Kelly, who recently commented on a post I did on Facebook about the trauma of this current climate, both religious and government. And Miss Kelly's class, she was an English teacher. And in her class, I remember Miss Kelly working with my 5th grade teacher. So Miss Kelly was a high school teacher. And I remember as a 5th grader being put on a bus and taken to the graduate library at the University of Texas. And I had the privilege, money from a grandparent, to go to a private school where they taught me, this is what is so funny. The same school that caused so much trauma also taught me critical thinking, thank God. I don't know if they do that anymore, but they taught us critical thinking and they taught us research. And then I went to the University of Texas as an undergraduate and a graduate student. And the University of Texas is a research school, which teaches us kind of like that, you know, when you hear a thought or have a hypothesis, you look for evidence, not just biased evidence, but you go and look for valid sources and more than one. And I remember there was a time in my life before the first time that Trump was in office, my dad was real into YouTube, ironically. And I was like, get off of YouTube. And my dad made some financial decisions based on QAnon BS that he saw on YouTube. And my brother sent me a text and was like, oh my God, Dad's doing this thing. And it took me about 2 seconds to research it. And I was like, oh my God, that's fraud, right? That's mortgage fraud, what he was trying to pay a bill a certain way. I don't want to get into the details of it. But later that year, my dad was making financial decisions on behalf of him and my mom based on this bullshit on YouTube without ever vetting it. And that's what's so funny. It took one search for me to come up in the top of the search to find out legally that is fraud and the financial ramifications for attempting to make payments this way with not your money. And my dad was in some financial stress, and my dad also struggles with depression. I'm not outing anything he hadn't outed for himself. I guess I am on YouTube, but this is my family heritage is struggling with depression. And I don't know, somewhere along the way, he quit taking his meds. We didn't know this, but my dad ended up in the hospital for 3 weeks. I couldn't figure out why. And it turns out that some of the decisions he made led to some of these health problems that led to him being in the hospital, that led to all 5 of his children and 4 of them who have spouses and my mother sitting with him and altering our lives to be with my dad in the hospital for 24/7, my sister advocating for him and all these things. And when he finally woke up after about 3 weeks, the first thing he did was pull out YouTube. And I'm sitting there trying to be very mindful. And I say, Dad, help me understand. And I was really trying to be compassionate. I really genuinely was. I didn't know about parts work back then. But I was like, Dad, help me understand what's so important about these videos. And he goes, it ain't harming anybody. And he bit at me. And I just stood up and I said, fuck you, I'm out of here. And I did. I was disrespectful and childish and rude. But I was like, are you kidding? It's harmless. The harm has put you in the hospital, and that hospital has caused a major inconvenience for your entire family. We've all put our lives on hold to come and rally for you. And just the dismissal of it. And then I look back and see that, like, I've been gaslit my whole life. It's not that big of a deal. Don't worry. And I do believe that there are times when worry can be a problem, but worry Yes, it's a thought. But not all of our thoughts that aren't feel good are bad. So if you go back to Interoception, and so many of the things that we're taught as very young children actually stop the synapses from making connections around self-trust. And they use the dangling carrot of attachment, belonging, and attunement, which are the most powerful forces on earth. They are the deepest psychological hooks that can be used against us because they work. And they have worked in me. And as I am still in the process of just being somebody who slows down. Listen, it wasn't easy for me to slow down. And it was a decision I made, and then a decision my body supported. And instead of being impulsive, give myself dopamine hits and impulses other ways. But if I was going to continue this self-examination and it wasn't going to be self-beat, it was going to have to be done with compassionate inquiry. Allison, where did you get this belief? And tracing back, right? Kind of like follow the money, follow the motive. When I look at, even my dad's decisions of behavior that I don't like, if we go back to the motive, I see something different. And the more I had compassion with my own parts and their own motives, which were generally had benevolent intent, which is something we say all parts have benevolent intent. So even if you have a part of you that is behaving in destructive ways, drinking too much, shopping too much. I do think there are some people that go out and just do shitty things, but most of us are not waking up saying, you know what, I think I would like to behave in ways that harm me, harm my family, that are self-destructive or destructive to other people. And then at the end of the day, we're like, why did I do that? I know better. We're looking at, we say, why do we do that? But we don't compassionately look at, inquire, sort through, witness, listen. Where do we learn those things and what's really true? And so I've done a lot of that with corporations and money. And listen, I spend way too much money on Amazon. Of all the things that I've divested from, I am not able to do that right now. My core psychological need is comfort, which I think actually is one of the reasons I do the work around uncomfortable emotions and uncomfortable seeing, because my need for comfort was exploited. And a couple of years ago, one of my friends from TikTok and I had a conversation, and he's done a lot of the deconstruction too. We were both late diagnosed autism and ADHD, and so there was that parallel. And I was talking with him about, I just felt really frustrated because I'm in this industry. I work for myself, and I actually have pretty high fees for my coaching. Not the highest, but definitely not the lowest. Definitely higher than a therapist. I have made all of my income, and I am the primary breadwinner for my family and have been for 22 years. My husband's a retired teacher, and so we have a small base, and I have some safety with insurance through him. But any lifestyle we live which is pretty modest, believe it or not. We try to live below our means, which I've had to do the last 3 years because my income tanked because I had a heart attack. But I was like, I can't participate in this. And my friend helped me see the difference between capitalism. His name is Jay Winia. And he helped me make this distinction between capitalism and commerce. And he said commerce existed long before capitalism. And capitalism is a system, a giant system that benefits those who run the system, and it usually involves an entanglement with the government. And in that entanglement with the government is inherently exploitation. And that word right there got me. And I was like, oh, I can participate in so commerce is the buying and selling of goods without exploitation. This got me excited because I see hope and possibility. I think that's one of the reasons there's so much grief, is because I'm not like, oh, the world is fucked, fatalist. We all, eat shit and then die. But that there are some really hard things. And if this is my gift, y'all. I've been using it for years, helping people. It's like, oh, here's the problem. And there is a song, by Mark Cohn called 29 Ways to Make It to My Baby's Door. 29 ways and something, maybe I can find more. And my brain always converts that. I got 99 ways to make it to my baby's door. And that's how my brain works. My brain will see, if there is a challenge, my brain doesn't go hopeless. My brain sees 99 real life solutions. It's one of the reasons I've been able to make my business work, is because I've been able to help people create both inner solutions and strategic outer solutions. I'm a strategist. And if you add without exploitation, and this was the piece that hurt my heart. I have hope because I believe that we can minimize exploitation. And so there are many things in the coaching industry that I have already, my good girl parts are like, I would never do that. I would never do this. I would never do this. And it's because it exploits people. Intentionally. Here's how to manipulate people. Here's how to use language to supposedly get people to make a decision. No, here's how to manipulate people into saying yes. Here's how to get people to say yes instead of, I offer a service, and my job is to help both of us come to a place about self-trust. If this is the right time, the right fit, the right process, the right container, the right price. My job is to trust me, and if we're a match, and your job is to trust you if it's right for you. Instead of, let me take your credit card now, which is something that's actually taught in sales school. And how can I do my business without exploiting others was easy for me forever. But I did look up in 2021 and saw 22 that I was exploiting myself as somebody who identifies as a recovering overachiever, a recovering people pleaser, and somebody who in the past had attracted a whole bunch of user friends. People that I'm not saying they knew, maybe some of them did. Maybe some of them are opposite psychologies, just help. But it got real clear when one of my supposedly best friends, who has work of her own, but it's not my people's work, it's her people's work. But she would come to my events, and one day she got really fucking mad at me and said, she stormed out of a room that I was teaching and facilitating. And later on, when I talked to her about it, she says, I don't understand why I can't be visible in your business. Like I owed it to her. And that just did not cross my mind. And I was like, oh. And so as much as I can see, I am humble enough to admit that there are still areas where I have blind spots, or where I have been able to be exploited because of my tender heart's needs and my healing in the process of, but not quite yet healed, psychology and attachment issues. All of this for me is deconstruction, and it comes with grief. And most of us don't want to feel grief. That is a very common thing with parts. Most of us don't want to feel grief. Of course we don't. Because when we were little and felt grief, we damn well better had a good reason. Stop that crying bullshit was something I heard often. Sorry, Dad, but it's true. Stop that crying bullshit was often something I heard with a raised fist or a 6'5" man's shoulder bearing down on me. And at school, it was said with a much sweeter voice, but with the tagline, or you're going to hell, or you'll never find a husband. And so it took my greatest fears of being hurt and caused me to not trust myself. The reason I'm able to look at difficult things is because I trust myself to feel the difficult things. Do I like it? No. That's why I call it suffer better. I can't help you alleviate suffering. I mean, technically I can, but I can't help you eliminate it. I can help you learn how to suffer better. I am in the process of, and have learned a ton in the last 5 years, of learning how to suffer with more self-compassion and less shame. In fact, right now, the season of work I'm doing is meeting my shame parts and spending time with the parts of me that experience very intense psychological shame without words. It's fascinating. And so for me, deconstruction, and yes, you're exactly right. The dominoes start falling and all around. Remember in the Truman Show? When he starts to see the first little tear in the sky, it's been a while since I've seen that, but it's like, once you see, you can't unsee. And there have been many times when I said, it was so much easier to not know. It was so much easier to drink 2 bottles of wine a day. It was so much easier to bypass and spiritually leave this world and psychically live in the land of positivity, which is funny because this week my husband reminded me he's on a trip to the WinStar in North Oklahoma, going to Denton to see a bunch of friends and going to a concert up there. And however many years ago, I can't remember what he said, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, at this time, he won $18,000. And right before he won $18,000, I had a post that, not that I'm really proud of this now, but LL Cool J, I'm proud of that one, and P. Diddy shared a piece of my art. And that art said something about be positive and be around positive people. And I would never share that piece of art today. I don't have that belief. I will never gaslight you into being positive. That's what was done to me. And so, hi, my name is Allison. I do this really depressing work of deconstructing with so much compassion. But on the other side of the deconstruction and woven into the grief are these glimpses of building a repertoire, building time on task with me and my parts, like we call it self-leadership. So how do I, from my chorus wisest self, learn how to lead these parts of me? I don't want to exile them. I don't want them running the show, but giving them the care and love I always needed, giving them the validity. Do you know how many times when I explore with fearful parts, what are your fears and concerns? And every single time a part, so my inner world communicates in words. We have a lot of inner conversation, sometimes pictures, but my parts will tell me their fears and concerns. And do you know every single time those fears and concerns are valid? They may not be the most probable, but yeah, that could happen. And the biggest one for me, for many years, I had this big internal unconscious fear that I would be left. My dad left when we were little, and my mom and dad would fight, and he would go out the door, and no adult had the ability to say, Mommy and Daddy are fighting. We need to go to our corners and rest and relax and get regulated before we make up. But nobody ever said Daddy will be back. And then my first husband walked out the door at 4 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon. And to this day, I still don't know why. I think I'm fucking fabulous. And then I used to be very afraid in my current marriage, like, oh, Bill's going to leave me. And then I got afraid I was going to leave Bill. And so I did a lot of work around those parts that are leaving. And one of my parts one day said, oh, I'm afraid Bill's going to leave. And I was talking to her. I was sitting on the bathtub in one of my houses. And I was sitting on the bathtub. I had backed out of a fight that I was having with my husband. And I was like, I'm about to lose my shit, because I used to really rage. And I was taught in my family, and my husband and I agreed we wouldn't do that. But I had this huge rage problem. And so I was like, hold on, I'm about to blow my top. Let me put a time out. And I pulled back, and I didn't know parts work at the time, but I did know inner child work. And so I was like, what's going on here? Why am I losing my shit? Right. What's hurting? What's the motive? And I just heard this little part say, I'm afraid he's going to leave. And it made me feel compassion towards her. And then I went out into the conversation with my husband, and I said, I'm sorry, I'm getting so flustered. I said, I think underneath this all is I'm just afraid you're going to leave. And my husband at the time, this is very early in our marriage. We've been married almost 17 years now. And his shoulders just relaxed. And he goes, we can argue without me leaving. And that was monumental, because my body didn't have that belief. Maybe my head did, but my body had never experienced that belief of arguing without the man leaving. And I was able to update those parts. We'll come down the road. I could honestly tell my parts, yeah, I get it. You're afraid of being left by Bill. And here's the thing. We can't control our husband. And he may never want to leave us, but he might die of a heart attack or get hit by a bus. There could be an accident, and they could call us tomorrow and say that he's gone. And so in essence, we would be left. And I told that part as true, like with so much truth, just held her fear and said, yeah, that would be really scary and that would hurt. And even if Bill were to leave or something were to happen, I will never leave you. I will never leave myself. And so all these systems are set up. That's why they're called systems of oppression. What are they oppressing? They're oppressing our autonomy. They're oppressing our, not just equality is what we see out there. It's important. Trust me, it's important. But right, like this is an inside job too. And it's so much easier to oppress us in the outside job, in the outside structures, if we've also been psychologically oppressed. In my limited, tiny experience, I have a part of me that's afraid to say this because I don't want to get in trouble for saying it wrong. I'm not an expert in this, but from what I've understood listening to my Black friends, Black teachers, they are born knowing they are oppressed. And white women especially, and white men too, frankly. We are not born knowing that we're oppressed unless you come from an already marginalized community, whether that is your sexual orientation, whether it's your identity, or whether it is your socioeconomic status. We don't recognize the ways we're psychologically oppressed. And we are oppressed. And that does not mean that yes, we are victims, but that does not mean we are defeated. When we can see what we are victims of, then we can strategize the very next right. We can strategize a long-term vision, and we can strategize hope for the future. May have to make this a podcast episode. We'll see. Thank you.